Hello and welcome to Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments and business trends shaping the global economy. I'm Rob Moulton, a partner in Latham & Watkins' London office. In this episode, part of a 10-part series complementing Latham's 10 key focus areas for UK regulated firms in 2024 report, we discuss conduct and culture. And to do this, I'm joined by my colleague from the London office, partner Nell Perks. Nell, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Rob.
And a very important topic, and one that regulators have said lots about. Do you think that the proposals on diversity and inclusivity will drive the sort of cultural change that they're seeking?
Well, Rob, so the regulators published their linked consultations on diversity and inclusion in financial services just towards the end of last year. And I think it's clear from those that they see diversity and inclusion as the cornerstone of a healthy culture, not least because of their importance in promoting challenge, reducing groupthink, and in ensuring stronger governance and decision-making and risk management. So what they're proposing is new diversity and inclusion reporting and disclosure requirements for larger firms, and larger firms are going to need to set a diversity and inclusion strategy with specific targets. I think one of the interesting things about the approach that the regulators are taking is that they're leaving it to firms to be responsible for developing their own strategies and targets rather than setting prescriptive targets. I think that's helpful in avoiding diversity and inclusion becoming a box-ticking exercise. And I think it gives firms the freedom and flexibility that should help deliver the right sort of change. So in the same way that it's not for the regulators to dictate what culture a firm should have, I think it's probably right that it's not right for regulators to dictate what diversity and inclusion should look like for a particular firm. I guess the counter to that is, are they holding firms properly accountable, and what the accountability will be? I don't know if you have a different view on that.
No, I mean, I suspect that accountability, firms will like being able to say what they've got to do and define their own culture. But of course, then that does put the onus back on them to then be able to say, well, we've said it's this is what we want. I guess, is this one of those, how will a firm show that it's not only talking the talk, but walking the walk points now?
Yeah, I think that's right. And the regulators have said that firms are going to have their diversity and inclusion strategies in a place that is publicly accessible. And the board will be responsible for overseeing and ensuring that they are maintaining the strategy. So I think that will help. And the PRA has proposed that diversity and inclusion strategies should include the firm's core values and the culture that it's trying to create and its commitment to diversity and inclusion. So it will require firms to take a holistic view of the approach they're taking and consider how diversity and inclusion sits with that culture. So I think it's helpful that they're acknowledging the very strong link between diversity and inclusion and culture, and doing it in a way which there will be some accountability for. What I think may be less helpful in achieving their aims is the targets, which are designed to address underrepresentation in firms. The FCA isn't going to mandate which demographic characteristics the targets must cover, but the PRA has said that it expects CRR and Solvency II firms to set targets for gender and ethnicity at a minimum. And I think while I do see the value that targets can bring, and they certainly do add accountability, so it's not necessarily the wrong approach, I'm less convinced on whether that will drive the cultural change that they're seeking.
No, I mean, maybe that's a bit of a gamble by them, Nell, to say, look, this is a little untested, this ground, so we're going to try it with some statistics that one can track in order to try to come up with some targets. One that really interested me, Nell, so tell me what you think, is they talk a lot about socioeconomic diversity, but they're not setting a target for it. Why are they talking but not tracking that one?
I suspect that the reason for that is that although everyone acknowledges that socioeconomic diversity is absolutely key to achieving diversity in all areas, it is harder to track and manage. It requires people to give quite a lot of personal information about themselves. And so I think they're probably focusing, at least at first, on something which is more obvious and easily trackable. I think, though, that does end up risking not achieving what they want to, because things like socioeconomic background, regional background, and personality type, they're really the kind of areas where diversity is something that will promote challenge and avoid groupthink. Actually, things like gender and ethnicity may be less likely to. I don't know. And Robert, the other question I guess I have for you is on the reporting requirements for inclusion and how effective you think they're going to be and whether they will achieve the right kind of change.
Again, I think they must just be an area where the regulators feel they have to do something and they're not certain whether this will work or not, but a gamble worth taking because they think there is something of a gap between where the industry thinks it is and where the regulator thinks the industry is. So they're trying to force change through, I think, by those sorts of methods. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I suspect actually the culture you have, though, is going to end up being at the centre of it all, and it becomes a bit circular because there's a risk that if you're asking employees whether they feel safe to speak up, if you have a culture where they don't feel safe to speak up, they won't be giving honest answers to that question. And so your metrics end up being skewed.
So now let's move on to non-financial misconduct. How are firms supposed to think about FCA's proposed new guidance? Is it going to help or hinder them? Is this an area where more guidance, which is usually welcomed, will actually make analysis more awkward?
The intention of the guidance is clearly to assist firms in giving them more examples and giving them sort of stricter rules to follow when they're assessing fitness and propriety or applying the conduct rules in the context of non-financial misconduct. Where I think it will be helpful is in setting out regulatory expectations more clearly. As we all know, following some unfavourable results in the upper tribunal, particularly Frensham, the FCA is wanting to ensure that there is greater consistency, and it has explicitly stated that that is one of its aims. So the FCA is going to be adding explanations about non-financial misconduct and how it can impact an individual's fitness and propriety. That will include stating that misconduct outside the workplace can be relevant. And the FCA has gone so far as saying that serious non-financial misconduct outside of work will almost always be relevant to an individual's fitness and propriety, either because it calls their integrity into question or because it threatens public confidence in the industry. So I think on one hand, that does provide greater clarity and clears up an issue that we get asked about time and time again. But what remains unclear is when something is going to be sufficiently serious for this to have effect. So overall, I think the helpfulness for firms of this guidance is probably neutral. There may be some extreme examples at either end where we will now have clarity, but most instances of non-financial misconduct are still going to fall in grey areas and there will be uncertainty on those.
Do you read this as an attempt to overturn Frensham by secret guidance by the regulator that ignores what the court said, or am I being too tricky about that?
No, I think that's exactly how I read it as well, Rob. And I think the FCA was almost explicit when saying that they want greater clarity in judicial settings. That seems to me almost exactly what they were talking about. Rob, I don't know if you have different views on the guidance in relation to the conduct rules and whether that is more helpful.
I think that the position was reasonably clear beforehand, and ultimately these are judgments that senior managers need to make. And they probably had enough guidance beforehand to say, you need to decide whether or not there is a problem with an individual and act appropriately. And that's your judgment. And actually giving guidance on detailed situations where they're always dependent on what happens on the ground, I wonder how helpful that is, because these things are always so dependent on the individual, their background, their history, their role, all of those things. I'm not sure that more guidance will help people make better decisions here.
I think that's right. I think the useful thing is clarifying that COCON doesn't cover personal or private life. By COCON, I'm referring to the FCA's conduct rules, which are applicable to individuals. So I think that is sort of one helpful thing. But again, I think where most of the issues are going to arise will be in the grey areas. So we know that sexual misconduct towards a colleague at a firm event would be within the scope of COCON, and the same behaviour at a purely personal event organised by the individual wouldn't be. But what happens with after-work drinks, or when you go on for one more drink after that, that's where the issues will be.
So let's take one step back and just thinking forward to 2024, when you're helping clients, when you're in their boardroom now, what do you tell them are the big steps that they should be taking to meet the regulatory expectations to improve their culture?
Big picture, I think the most important thing that a firm can do is have a clear idea of its purpose and what it's trying to achieve, how those are aligned, and then ensure that that's applied through the organisation consistently. So it's really important to have a framework that runs through the firm, including all three lines of defence, and having a joined up approach. And then my view is really that if the organisation as a whole has a clear view of its culture, then the rest will follow from that. And another recommendation I would make is really remembering that culture is always evolving and it never reaches a static endpoint. So firms can't afford to stop reflecting on and seeking to improve their culture throughout. They need to keep on measuring and monitoring all the things that contribute to having a good culture. And then it's essential to keep on reflecting on your cultural trajectory in a meaningful and objective way to ensure that you are carrying on progressing along the right trajectory.
Well, that's great advice, Nell, and I've really enjoyed that discussion. Thanks very much for joining me.
Thanks very much, Rob. It's been great.
And thank you for listening to this episode in our Connected with Latham podcast series. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcasts on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like more information about the topics in this podcast or to access our 10 key focus areas in 2024 report, please visit the link located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10020. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.